Welcome everyone to this live session on Lebanon. This week, the VVD International looks back on the year 2020. We do this by a series of 3 webcasts on Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And today is the second edition on the topic of the Lebanese Blasts.
Breaking news from Lebanon. The capital, Beirut, has been hit by a massive explosion. Dozens of people are said to be injured, and there are some reports of people trapped under the rubble. The cause of the blast is not yet known.
A massive explosion sent shockwaves tearing through the Lebanese capital.
يا خايف بس شو في حل؟ خايف من كورونا وخايف من الجوع وخايف على اهلي وخايف على اصحابي، مش عارف على شو بدي اخاف بالاول. مش عم بعرف صراحه.
As you could see in this short video clip, the year 2020 has been very tumultuous for Lebanon. And we're going to talk about this with 4 prominent guest speakers. But before I introduce them to you in a few minutes, I would like to emphasize that we want to interact with you as much as possible. I know people are watching from Lebanon, from other countries in the Middle East, from Europe, from all other parts of the world, and we are very curious to hear your questions and also your views. So please put them in the comments on Facebook, and those questions will come in on my screen, and I will try to use them as much as possible in our conversation with our speakers. After I've introduced our speakers, we are going to structure this session in 3 blocks. The first part will be about 2020 and about the current issues that Lebanon is facing. We will also focus on the root causes for these issues. In the second block, we are going to talk about the role of foreign powers. What role do these powers currently play, and what can and should they do differently in order to create a better situation in Lebanon? And in the third part, we are going to talk about the future of Lebanon. We are going to focus on potential solutions and about potential reforms that are needed to make 2021 a better year for Lebanon. Let me now move over to introducing our guest speakers. And I would like to start with our first guest speaker for this session. It is Paul Salem. He is joining us from Washington, D.C., where he works as the president of the Middle East Institute. He is an expert on Lebanon and an expert on the region. He's the author of various books and also was the director and founder of various think tanks, all focusing on the Middle East. Paul, thank you very much for joining us. First, as an introduction, I'm very curious to hear from you in your own words, given the long experience that you have. How do you consider the year 2020 in Lebanon?
Well, thank you, Ruben, and welcome to everybody listening around the world. 2020, to put it in some historical perspective, is the 100th anniversary of the establishment of what we now know as Lebanon. And in these 100 years, this country has gone through a lot of ups and downs, the worst of which was a 15-year civil war between 1975 and 1990. But it's also had high points and high moments when it was the cultural and economic capital of the Middle East. So it's had a very sort of interesting modern history. 2020 also marks 30 years since the end of the Civil War and 3 decades of the rule of a post-war oligarchy, which really came to a point of bankruptcy, and that I mean both literally in terms of the economy and political economy that sustained this oligarchy for 30 years, built on deficit financing, high interest rates, a kind of Ponzi scheme, which allowed Lebanon to continue to grow economically but acquire massive debt. That political economy came crashing down both in 2019 and 2020, and that oligarchy that thrived on this political economy for the first time in 30 years faced a very major uprising, I would say, beginning in 2019 in October, and it continued through 2020. So part of what we're experiencing, what we did experience in 2020, was the awakening of a population that for too long had maybe looked the other way as the oligarchy did what it did, a population that finally realized the cost of this corrupt oligarchic sectarian system and is beginning to look for an alternative. And now 2020 was also the year of the pandemic, like the rest of the world experienced. And as one of the early, the clips that you showed in the introduction, the Lebanese population is really dazed, and I would say, in shock, given the multiple blasts, as you put it, devastation of their savings, loss of jobs, loss of income, a complete loss of confidence in the oligarchy or the political class, and a raging pandemic which is sequestering them in their homes at a time when maybe they want to protest, so they don't know where to turn. And that all was really further shaken by the horrific blast of August 4, which the population legitimately blames on this ruling class one way or another. They knew about it, and they didn't do anything about it.
Thank you very much, Paul, for putting the year 2020 in historical perspective and already mentioning one of the key issues, both in the economic situation, the pandemic, and of course the explosion that happened in August. We are going to discuss these issues in more depth over this session. Thank you, Paul. I would now like to move to our second guest speaker. Our second guest speaker is joining from Lebanon. Her name is Diasy Mohr. She is a Dutch journalist working for the major Dutch news agency. She has lived in Lebanon for 18 years, so she has a lot of underground experience. Diasy, Paul, in his introduction, already mentioned a lot of the issues that happened last year. How is the current situation in Lebanon? How is the current population surviving, if I may use that word?
Good evening, Ruben. It's good to be here with you. Thank you very much. I think by the time the blast on August 4th happened, many Lebanese had the feeling we had already hit rock bottom here. The situation was very difficult economically, politically, and I think no one could have expected what happened on August 4th. And the aftermath was truly shocking for so many people. And I think for many also the final straw. I see so many people around me that want to leave the country, that are desperately searching for options outside. However much they love Lebanon, there's a real big brain drain of very highly educated trilingual people that are now searching for a future elsewhere. You see it in the medical sector. Yesterday, I was in one of the big public hospitals here in Beirut, and there is no doctor that says they're not looking for opportunities abroad. We see many leaving, many nurses leaving, and they are not the only sector that is, going through this process. And that on top of the corona crisis that is currently, very big here, very challenging because of all the, economic aspects involved in it. So I would say in the 18 years that I've been here, this must be the most difficult time that I've seen the country dealing with.
Thank you, Diasy, for sharing this experience and for this perspective, and also this glim situation. And also thank you for raising the issue of brain drain, especially in the medical sector, because I think that's a perfect way to introduce our third guest speaker, who is Basem Shabb. Basem is also joining us from Beirut. He was not only a member of parliament for 13 years, but also has an extensive medical career. He is a surgeon and working as an associate professor for the Lebanese American University, and also a practicing surgeon. Basem, Diasy just mentioned that there are many people are leaving the country, and especially in the health sector, that's causing huge issues. Is that also something that you are experiencing in your work as a key problem that needs to be solved? We cannot hear you, Basem. We're trying to make a connection with you. We can still not hear you.
So I think you can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah, I concur with what Paul and Diasy said. We are not in a good situation. 2020 was not a good year for Lebanon. Two of the things were expected, economic and financial downfall. But the corona and the explosion really did not help. There is an impressive brain drain. I think the center that Diasy was referring to has had more than 40 doctors leave. They are leaving to the West, they are leaving to the Gulf. And the problem is the people who are leaving are the people who are well-trained and who are easily picked up by companies and hospitals abroad. And so in given institution, it is the good people who are leaving, and I'm sorry to say that. And education and healthcare were two of the pillars that made Lebanon what it is, and both are being eroded very quickly, I would add.
Thank you very much, Basem, to share these first experiences. And also thank you very much for staying in Lebanon and doing such important work on the ground. We are going to talk about this situation, of course, much more over this session. Let me now introduce our fourth guest speaker, who is Tarek Mitri. He's also joining us from Lebanon. He was the former Under-Secretary General for the United Nations. He was also a minister in 4 cabinets in Lebanon, and he's now the president of the St. George University in Beirut. Tarek, may I ask you the same question that I asked to Paul, because you have a long experience in Lebanon. How would you, in your own words, describe the year 2020 if you compare it to previous years?
Thank you for having me with you this afternoon. The disaster of August 4th, attributed to criminal negligence, is only the latest, if the most dramatic and devastating, is the latest manifestation of a dysfunctioning state for many years. This has been going on for quite a few years. And these young men and women that took to the streets in 2019 and 2020 identified their rulers as kleptocrats. They have asked for more accountability in a country where there is hardly any. They have condemned the ineptitude, the incompetence, and of course the dishonesty of their predatory politicians. But the crisis is also the crisis of our system. We were, until a few years ago, at least some of us, some of the political theorists and others, referred to the political system and this is probably a notion that is familiar to you, Dutch, as a consociational democracy, as a democracy that allows power sharing between the representatives of various communities. And I think in the last few years, the so-called consociational democracy has turned into what many and I call a vetocracy, whereby the system is paralyzed, and therefore the state institutions are weakened to the point of fragmentation because of the veto that is exercised not only by the Hezbollah, which is a strong military cum political party that has the means to exercise its veto and paralyze the state, but also by other politicians that represent the presumed interests of their own communities. So we've seen the total failure of this system. The trouble is that against the background of a difficult economic crisis, this may not be the time to talk about political reforms. The insistence on trying to salvage what is left of our economy, try to prevent the starvation of many Lebanese who are below poverty line, seems to be the priority.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tarek, for this first political analysis, which I think was very interesting. We are going to talk more about this in our first block, but also in the third block, when we talk about potential reforms and potential solutions. We now start with the first part of our session, which is about the year 2020 and the current issues that Lebanon is facing. Some issues were already mentioned in the introductions by our guest speakers. Of course, the economic situation, the political complexity, also the health crisis as a result of COVID, and of course the impact of the explosion. We are going to talk more about these issues and also about the root causes for these issues, because why does it seem that Lebanon is so often in a crisis situation?
The blast happened in the port area. It looks as if the first explosion was followed by another, much larger one, which swept through many nearby buildings.
لما بدك تطلب من المواطن يلتزم بالتعبئة العامة، أنت بدك تقوم بدورك كمان اليوم. بدك تأمن للمواطن حاجاته الأساسية اللي هي لقمة العيش. إذا ما أمنت له إياها ما رح تشوفه بقى قاعد ملتزم وقاعد ببيته، لأنه الجوع ما بيرحم حدا. لأنه لما بتشوف ابنك عم يبكي من الجوع ما بقى بيعني لك لا كورونا ولا بقى بيعني لك قرار دولة ولا بيعني لك وطن أصلاً من الأساس.
The challenges we are facing actually right now are the isolation of Lebanon. And we have lost almost our relationships. We need to take down this whole establishment and carry out transparent elections.
In this short video, we saw many of the issues illustrated as we just discussed and mentioned. And I'll go to talk more about this with our guest speakers, and we will do that in this block in pairs. And first, I would like to ask Paul and Diasy to come in. As you saw in the video clip, poverty and hunger is a key issue currently in Lebanon. And maybe, Diasy, maybe you can share what you see as the root causes for this level of poverty, because as you already said in your introduction, it's not something new. What do you think are the key reasons for that?
The poverty that we see today is something fairly new. It's something that was really escalated by the economic crisis and the huge inflation that started late last year. Basically, the Lebanese pound is, well, sort of worthless, and people have lost their pensions, people have lost their savings. What was 15,000 Lebanese pound to the dollar is today on the black market around 8,000 to 9,000 Lebanese pound to the dollar. So if you have some of your savings in Lebanese pound, and if you're lucky enough to get this out of your bank account, it's not worth very much. Prices increase all the time. People are losing their jobs on a daily basis, and we've seen this going on for the past months, actually, since late last year. And so the poverty that I'm seeing while reporting these days is really something we haven't seen before, and it's very painful and it's very shocking to see.
Thank you, Diasy. Paul, in the introduction, you also already mentioned the economic situation and that it's worse than before. Do you think it is caused by structural weaknesses in the economy, or is it more a matter of a mismanagement by the financial elite?
Of mismanagement, not only by successive governments, but an entire, I would say, banking class. And Lebanon has had a very large banking system and was very proud of it. And these banking elites, in other words, if you want, the banking bourgeoisie of Lebanon, went along for the last 30 years with this deficit financing, the banks putting their money in government debt and accepting high interest rates and not having to work for bank profits and making billions of dollars along the way. So it was a series of choices that created, at the end of the day, a kind of a Ponzi scheme, if you will, based on high interest rates in Lebanon, a very large Lebanese diaspora that was convinced by the Lebanese banks that they are solid and that you should put your money with them. And so this large diaspora, as well as others from the Gulf and from Syria, I would say, put their money in this banking system. And this banking system simply, loaned the money to the government, and the government wasted it. So it is definitely a disaster, an economic disaster, that is the result of policy, not only of the oligarchy itself, but an entire kind of business class that went along with these easy profits and only very, very late realized the disaster that they were in. Now, there's also geopolitical realities that in the post-war situation, the main post-war prime minister, Rafiq al-Hariri, who was eventually assassinated in 2005, in the 90s, tried to lead the economic reconstruction and revival of Lebanon. But his project to make Lebanon kind of what you might call an early Dubai ran up against Hezbollah's project and Iran and Syria's project to make Lebanon a front line against Syria. And those projects contradicted each other, eventually led to the demise of one, and in fact the killing of the leader of it, and the resistance, confrontation, military project coming to the fore. And in that type of geopolitical situation, it's very hard to grow an economy, particularly grow it up to carry the debt that was accumulated.
Yeah. I can imagine that makes it even more complicated, and we are going to talk about the role of geopolitics more in the second block. Diasy, maybe one more question to you, because you also described the situation that people are facing and also that their bank accounts are under risk, so to say. How are people dealing with this? How are they still managing to get sufficient food and other basic necessities?
I mean, it's a very close-knit society. Families help each other. There's so many initiatives taken by individuals that want to help. It's something we saw after the blast as well, when things even got worse. And it's very, very impressive to see how people are ready to help each other, and so many charity initiatives amongst the people, amongst families, and also because they simply know that they cannot count on the government to help them. So they really have to, count on each other. But I see families that cannot no longer pay, the education of their children, cannot pay school fees or university fees, have really, to downskill, like cannot no longer pay their rent. And it's something they are not used to. And it's something that is really hard and is likely to just get worse and worse. I don't see any way in which in 2021 this is going to get better, and everyone seems to get ready for a year that is economically even harder than this one was.
Thank you, Diasy, and also thank you, Paul, for sharing your first views on the issues. I would now like to go to Basem and Tarek. Maybe, Basem, Diasy also mentioned the educational system. You are working on a university. Do you see that the education system and also universities are still intact, also after the explosion, or are there a lot of issues as well?
There are a lot of issues with especially the private leading universities who have fiscal issues, monetary issues. They just raised the exchange rate, which is going to make it difficult for students to pay their tuition. It's going to make it for patients more expensive to get treatment. And frankly, there's a segment, political parties who want to see the private institutions weaken. They've lobbied long and hard for the Lebanese public universities and schools, and wouldn't mind some of the private universities going under. We can see the vicious attacks on the American University of Beirut repeatedly by pro-Iranian media. So the survival of private universities is not just for the educational sector. It also affects the pro-Western image of Lebanon and the issue of liberal education. Mm-hmm. What is at stake is the issue of liberal education, not education. Mm-hmm. We're not interested in only technical education. And if any of these big universities fold, then it would be a major catastrophe for Lebanon.
Yeah, can imagine. Thank you, Basem. Tarek, in your introduction, and also we saw it in the video clip, you mentioned something about the political system and about the establishment. I would like to ask you something about the protest movements, because we saw them at the end of last year, early this year, also right after the explosions. Do you think that they are still having an impact? And that's a question from the audience that came in from David, is Lebanon becoming a bit like Venezuela, where we have seen protests going on for a long time, but a political system that remains the same?
That's a difficult question for me to answer. But I think a system such as ours, which is not just a dysfunctioning political system, autocracy, as I called it, it's a system based on power sharing between representatives of community. It's a communalist system. Sectarian, some would like to call it. I prefer to call it communalist. And this is a system that is difficult to change. That's not to say it's a fatality, but it's quite difficult to change. And those young men and women who were in the streets protesting against not just one government, but against politicians in general, who failed to deliver on any count. These people came across as citizens rather than as members of community. Mm-hmm. But it will take a lot of time for a critical mass of citizens to coalesce and wield political power that would counterbalance, I would say, the communalist political forces that have ruled the country since since its inception, since 100 years. So there are changes that we see. I'm sure what has happened in the last few years has impacted the country and significantly, but it will take more time before it will bear fruits. Some would hope that in 2 years the elections will help bringing into the political scene a new generation of political elites. We'll see.
Thank you, Tarek. And we are going to talk more about potential reforms and political solutions in the third block. I would now like to ask all our guest speakers to come in. And I would like to take a question from the audience that came in before the session, and that was about the explosion. And maybe, Paul, you can answer that question. Maybe, do you see that there is a good international response to what happened in the harbor of Beirut? Do you see aid coming into a sufficient level, or is it all taking too slow? And what are the reasons for that?
I would say the international reaction was quick and was very proactive. It was led by the French President Macron, who came immediately to Beirut and went down on the street, something that the Lebanese president didn't do, nor the Lebanese prime minister, any of the officials. The aid that was offered, both for immediate relief, but also to help in Lebanon's long-term reform and recovery, remains significant, remains on the table. But the problem has been that on the Lebanese side, first of all, the international community does not trust the Lebanese government to implement the immediate post-blast aid. So that's being channeled through NGOs and others, and my colleagues on the ground in Beirut would know more about it than me. But the major assistance, which remains on the table from Europe, the United States, IMF, and so on, requires, first of all, a Lebanese government to be formed. The current one is a caretaker government, and we're weeks and weeks into a very slow formation of a new government, a government that will not only promise serious structural reform, but implement it immediately and gain the confidence of the international community. There is a pathway for Lebanon to rebuild and recover, but it requires proper governance from either this government or, like Dr. Mitri said, we might have to await a change of leadership if elections are held in 2022 and if that brings about an actual change in leadership.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Diasy, Paul mentioned the role that NGOs can play when the state is not functioning properly. Do you see that the NGOs are playing an effective role and have the resources to reconstruct and rebuild Beirut?
Absolutely. I feel they're doing a very important job, and especially the local NGOs that have maybe taken on small projects, a couple of houses or maybe a street, private initiatives by people on the ground that have really done amazing work. So if I'm in these areas and I report there, what I see is that they've really been the ones that were fastest and most effective. Of course, the bigger international NGOs are doing a great job too, but I feel that, you know, the really local ones and grassroots ones have been most effective. But at the same time, maybe there was a big international response to the aftermath of the explosion. But if you go around in the areas, you see there's still a lot of work to be done. So many livelihoods that were, you know, lost, and it's really difficult to see. And this is something that will probably take a long, long time.
Thank you, Diasy. It's good to hear that there at least are some good initiatives on a small and local level by NGOs. One final question before we move to the next block. One thing that we haven't discussed so far is the refugee crisis, of course, which is also still continuing in Lebanon. Maybe, Tarek, can you say something about how the refugee crisis in Lebanon has been affected by the events that happened last year?
I think both Syrian and Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon have been sharing all the predicament of most of the Lebanese. We, for some time, and for political reasons that I need not dwell into, Syrian refugees were singled out as a burden on Lebanon, and many political parties and groups wanted them to go back, but the Syrian regime hasn't facilitated their return, so they're still in Lebanon. Perhaps their numbers have decreased, but they've been dependent largely not on Lebanese assistance, but on international assistance. Yeah. And this assistance, though it has diminished, continues to meet the very basic needs of the Syrian refugee community.
Yeah, Basem, is that what you see as well, that there are still some very basic level of education and health services to the refugees, even under this difficult circumstances?
I think there is a reasonable amount of support for the refugees. The problem is the host community is now sick. 50% of the Lebanese are below poverty level. Essentially, we have Lebanese refugees on Lebanese soil. What is needed now is, everybody agrees that we need change, but what is needed now is a quick infusion of cash and reforms within months. If we do not do that, then the amount of poverty, extreme poverty in the Lebanese population will increase, and the ability to support Syrian refugees would eventually also be affected. So I think the Syrian refugees, some people made an issue of them contributing to the demise of the Lebanese economy. But now the major issue is the 50% of the Lebanese who are below poverty level. Okay. Lebanon needs an immediate plan of reform, IMF, and rapid cash infusion. If we don't do that, we won't have time neither for change and nor for anything else. And I'm sorry to say, a lot of the Lebanese are going to end up like the Syrian refugees, but only in their own homeland.
Thank you very much, Basem, for this final note, because that is a perfect transition to the next session, which will be about the role of foreign powers. Because, as Basem just mentioned, international support is needed. And that's what we are going to talk more about in this second section. We are going to talk about the role of different foreign powers. For example, the role of neighboring countries like Israel and Syria. But also the influence of regional powers like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Iran. And also the role that global powers play, like the United States, Russia and the EU. We are going to talk about what their current impact is, but also what they can and what they should do in order to create a better situation in Lebanon.
Our prayers go out to all the victims and their families. The United States stands ready to assist Lebanon. We have a very good relationship with the people of Lebanon, and we will be there to help. It looks like a terrible attack.
Meanwhile, the war in Syria and the Israel-Palestine conflict show few signs of ending. In the middle of all this unrest is the tiny country of Lebanon. On the other side, Saudi Arabia is supported by Sunni groups. Many Sunnis believe that Iran is seeking disproportionate control over Lebanon. Many Lebanese Sunnis are also fighting in neighboring Syria against the Assad regime.
Iran has proxies. One of them is Hezbollah. Hezbollah just joined the government of Lebanon. That's a misnomer. They actually control the government of Lebanon. And that means that Iran controls the government of Lebanon.
Mais je l'ai dit très clairement, si au rendez-vous de fin octobre, ce sur quoi vos dirigeants se sont engagés n'est pas au rendez-vous, nous devrons en tirer les conséquences. Alors, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Ça veut dire, soit rien n'a été fait.
In this short video clip, we saw different international actors who all have ties with Lebanon and different groups in Lebanon and all interfere with what's happening in Lebanon. And we're going to discuss the role of foreign powers with our different guest speakers. And I will do that individually with each of them. And I would like to start with Tarek. Tarek, good to see you again. You have a lot of political experience, of course. And my first question that I would like to ask is, we have seen different actors in the clip. Which actor do you think is the most influential and the most important for Lebanon?
You know, to talk about all actors would take a lot of time. Let me say 2 words about the past and then focus on 2 actors today. I mean, in the past, Lebanon has been the battleground for many proxy wars, regional or even international. And this has contributed to aggravate the domestic problems of Lebanon for years. For some, not just the Israelis, but many Arabs, Arab countries that used to have influence in Lebanon, they tend to perceive Lebanon as being largely under the influence of Iran, as Hezbollah seems to be for the strongest political and military actor in the country. But I'm not going to talk about this. I would rather say a few words about both the United States and France. The United States is in a mode of sort of, one would argue endlessly about this, in a mode of retreat from this part of the world. But be that as it may, the United States see saving of Lebanon and weakening Hezbollah as complementary objectives. And as put pressure on Hezbollah, it's part of the maximum pressure they're putting on Iran. And I think that this is beneficial to Lebanon. The French do not see those 2 objectives, for the time being at least, as complementary, and would like to focus on saving Lebanon's economy. And saving Lebanon's economy has proven to be extremely difficult because it's conditional on reforms, and politicians of Lebanon have not been able to deliver on reforms, not even form a government that could negotiate with the International Monetary Fund. So they're falling back into a position of humanitarian assistance, waiting some political change. Now, when you talk to the French about grand geostrategic interests, they refer to Turkish influence in the Eastern Mediterranean and would like to see themselves as counterbalancing this influence. I think this is a bit exaggerated. The Turks are in Lebanon, but they have not become a major actor. There is a specific geographical zone in Lebanon where they have some influence, but they have not become a major player. It seems to me the major player is France. America has always been and continues to be. Arabs have withdrawn, and of course, Iran is all influential.
Thank you very much, Tarek, for this very clear analysis and for still being able in such a short time to mention all the different powers and their level of influence. Let me now move to Basem. Basem, do you agree with the analysis of Tarek? And also, maybe more particularly, how do you see the current role of Iran and Saudi Arabia and how their struggle or their fight for power, so to say, is impacting Lebanon?
Well, Lebanon, if you want to take a paradigm that would explain a lot of the happenings, Lebanon has been a tug of war between the East and West, essentially, through the civil war and even now. What has changed, however, is some actors have disappeared. And Syria, which ruled Lebanon for 3 decades, is no longer a power in Lebanon. Israel, which was a dominant power in Lebanon and internal politics, now views its interests in Lebanon through precision-guided missiles. So we were left with a vacuum that Iran filled very quickly. And right now, there are two, up until the French initiative, I would say, there was a tug of war between the United States and Iran. And but the other players have not been very influential. Even Saudi Arabia has decided 4 years ago not to fund the Lebanese army and has quietly withdrawn from the Lebanese political scene. Now we are, there was some quiet, I must say, during the Obama years when there was some understanding between Iran and the United States. But under the Trump years, of course, we paid the price with sanctions. Mm-hmm. And under the Obama years, we paid the price with increased Iranian influence. Mm-hmm. So it seems we can't make it either way, either with or without. Mm-hmm. But I am hopeful that with President Biden and this new transatlantic alliance that would give a greater weight and greater support to the French initiative and to Europe as a whole, I think that is a very credible counterbalance to Iranian influence. But to count on other influences is not very reasonable.
Thank you very much, Basem, and also ending with some optimistic words. You mentioned the EU. I would like to ask something about that to Diasy. Diasy, do you think that the EU, France, and maybe other European countries can make a difference in Lebanon, or is their power too weak?
Absolutely. I believe they can make a difference, and maybe especially right now. As mentioned, Lebanon is in great need of international aid, and the EU does provide a lot of it. And I think what we see now is that there is an increased demand for reform from the EU. Like this donor money is not coming unless there are significant changes, and I think they are putting up that rhetoric more, and I think it's very important. And obviously there's many things that the EU can do. Besides that, of course, stability for all these countries that have an interest in Lebanon is so important, because as mentioned earlier, if people will not immigrate through legal ways, people will really start to do so in other ways and arrive in Europe very soon.
Thank you, Diasy. And maybe one quick follow-up question, a question that came in from the audience from Hussein and also some of our Dutch participants. Can a small country like the Netherlands and also political parties, for example, can they make a difference for Lebanon and also in helping maybe in transition in the political system?
I believe that is happening not only now, but it's been going on for quite some years. I feel the projects that the Netherlands is doing here, for example, on refugee issues, on LGBT issues, on women's empowerment, are very effective. After all, it's this is a small country, so when these projects do take off and when there's good local partners that they work with, I think it does really make a difference.
Thank you, Diasy. That's very good to hear, especially for people in the Netherlands. Finally, let me go to Paul, because I think it was Tarek who already mentioned the potential impact of the transition from the Trump to the Biden administration. Paul, how do you see the potential impact on Lebanon of this transition?
Well, let me say first, again, to provide some sort of historical context, Lebanon is a country that lost or gave away its sovereignty 51 years ago. So we've been half a century without sovereignty. And that, trying to build a state and an economy without the very basics of statehood, which is sovereignty, is of course very, very difficult. Lebanon first lost or gave away its sovereignty in the 60s, late 1960s, to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, when many Arab states didn't want to confront Israel directly, so they say, well, why not use Lebanon as a proxy? That was replaced by Syrian dominance in the late 70s and all the way till 2005, when Syria did not want to confront Israel directly, so it used Lebanon as a proxy. And Iran, from the 80s onwards, has never confronted Israel directly and always preferred to use Lebanese or Syrians or Iraqis or others to put pressure on Israel. So we remain today in 2020 a state without any sovereignty. Hezbollah is a completely separate sovereign force with its own army, foreign policy, security services. And that really is the primary problem. And that absence of sovereignty, it is what then allows regional and international players to play in Lebanon. And only if the country manages to regain its sovereignty can we stop having these discussions, as it were, as to, you know, what's this other country going to do in ours. But now, getting to your question, and linked a bit to what Dr. Shabb and others were remarking on about variations between the Obama years, the Bush years, before that, Bush Jr., and now the Trump years. First, I would say in the incoming Biden administration, there is a lot of awareness and understanding of the complex situation that Lebanon is in. It is not a naive view. They know Lebanon well. They have concerns about Hezbollah, not to the acute extent of the Trump administration, but very, very serious hostility and concerns to Hezbollah. I think most of the sanctions relating to Hezbollah will remain. But I think the main difference will be that the Biden administration intends to resume or attempt to resume diplomatic back channel or direct channel talks with Iran. That means that indirectly, of course, they will be back channeling with Hezbollah as well. And certainly their interest is in stabilizing the situation in Lebanon. I don't think they perceive that they can have a win or that they can defeat Hezbollah or Iran. It is not a high priority for them, but they don't want Lebanon to collapse further. I'll end with an interesting note that even under the Trump administration, when Hezbollah, after the currency collapse, after the blast, and Hezbollah really was feeling the heat and the threat of more Trump sanctions, what did they do? They started negotiating with Israel, which are the ongoing maritime talks between Lebanon and Israel over the maritime borders, mediated by the United States. And those talks, effectively, everybody knows, are, you know, who's behind the scenes in Lebanon? It's Hezbollah. So Hezbollah plays this game. When it needs some protection, it'll talk to the Americans or talk to the Israelis, but really more to gain time than to create any fundamental change.
Clear. Thank you very much, Paul, for this very clear and strong analysis. I would like to ask many more follow-up questions, but we are running out of time. So let me quickly move on to our third and final block. Because in these last minutes, we are going to talk about the future of Lebanon. We're going to talk about some of the political reforms that were already mentioned. How should these potential reforms look like? And also what other solutions are needed to make 2021 a better year for Lebanon.
Within Lebanon's constitution is a guarantee that all citizens will have the same rights and duties without discrimination. But it also establishes a hardline balance of power among the country's many religions. These break down into more than half the population adhering to the two major Muslim faiths, Sunni and Shia, and about 35% are Christians, known as Maronites, Greek Catholic, and Greek Orthodox. The rest are a combination of Druze, an ancient Arabic religion, smaller Christian denominations, Jews, Baha'is, Buddhists, Hindus, and a very small proportion of Mormons. Legally, there are 4 Muslim and 12 Christian denominations, as well as Druze and Judaism, which together comprise the country's 18 official religions. These religions are allocated within the government as a result of an unwritten agreement established during the country's independence in 1943, known as the National Pact. it places a different member of each religion within a position of power. The president is required to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of the parliament a Shia Muslim, and so on.
As you could see in the short clip, the political situation in Lebanon and the system in Lebanon is quite complicated. But we have a few more minutes left, so we will do some quick question and answers with our guest speakers about the political situation and potential solutions. And we will do this again in pairs. And I see that that Basem and Paul are coming in. Maybe, Basem, if you could highlight only one solution or one political reform that would be key for Lebanon, which one would you prioritize?
I think what was planned is to have the House of Parliament, where their representation is regardless of religion, and to have a Senate whereby the different religions are represented. That was what the Taif Accord had stipulated, and which I think is a reasonable option. In defense of the sectarian system, I think it has offered two things. It has offered representation of minorities, which we saw was absent in nearby so-called socialist democratic countries, in which minorities had to be appointed to parliament after the elections. And another thing is freedoms. Freedoms in Lebanon have been related to sects, and by guaranteeing rights of representation to sects, you have safeguarded freedom of expression and also freedom of religion and other freedoms. And last but not least is that we've seen sectarian civil wars ravage Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, and Lebanon, because of that system, was partially spared. And a similar system was adopted, which Dr. Salem says very often, in Iraq. A similar system is applied in Iraq. So the system, I think, needs to be developed. It needs to be changed. But I am with evolution, not revolution.
Thank you very much, Basem, for your clear recommendation, also making the comparison with Iraq and the transition that's going on there. Paul, you mentioned earlier the economic situation and the Ponzi scheme and also the mismanagement of the financial elite. When we look at the economic situation, what would you consider the key solution or the key measure that needs to be implemented?
Well, I can't avoid commenting on the political side first. What is urgently needed on the political side is political change, in the sense, I mean, the current oligarchy was elected 2 years ago. The reform that's needed is vote the bastards out in 2022. Lebanon remains a competitive electoral system. It's the case that these politicians had good, patronage networks. The economy was helping them. So it doesn't require urgent structural political reform. It requires that the citizens vote these guys out, and that is doable. On the economic side, it's a combination of reform and simply change of policy. The reform has to do with certain sectors like electricity and telecommunications, which for too long have, certainly electricity has been a drain on the budget. And there are too many details to go into here, but there's clear things that need to be done there. There are clear things relating to corruption that need to be done. The IMF, the World Bank, everybody knows what the roadmap is. It's just that the oligarchy has benefited from these systems, and Hezbollah has benefited from these systems, so they don't want to change it. On the other side, it should be a change of policy, that for 30 years we've relied on deficit financing and incoming of cash rather than investing in jobs and building our various sectors. That needs to change, and I think we have an opportunity after this tragic collapse to rebuild in a proper way.
Thank you very much, Paul, for both your political suggestions and also for providing your economic solutions. Let me quickly move to Diasy and Tarek. Diasy, I want to ask you a question that came in from Anna Clara. She says that the primary problem in Lebanon is that people have become used to being dependent on others and that they are afraid to stand up and take responsibility. Do you also see that as an issue, and what do you think could be a solution to that? What do people need in order to be independent?
Well, that's true. People are always looking for help outside. But meanwhile, during the many protests that we saw since late last year, people do say we want to be independent. We don't want to depend on all those other countries. We want to do it ourselves. And however difficult that is, because, you know, the sense of nationalism among the people is complicated, because yes, there is a sense of nationalism, but everyone sees this in a different way, and you know, it depends on who you ask how they feel about their sense of nationalism in Lebanon. But so people do really want to be independent, and they want to do it themselves, and this is very much what they've been asking for during all those protests.
Thank you very much, Diasy. Tarek, final question to you, also from Anna Clara, and it's also a question that was asked by others. We have spoken a lot about people in Lebanon, also the impact of foreign powers, but there's also, of course, a big diaspora in the rest of the world, many Lebanese people living around the world. What do you think their role could be in a potential solution, and what would you recommend them doing?
You know, there are many Lebanese, as you said, all over the world, and they have an emotional and family attachment to Lebanon and strong family ties. And Lebanon's economy has been, to a great extent, dependent on their remittances. More than ever before, Lebanon needs its diaspora in making sure that the humanitarian assistance to the Lebanese and support to Lebanon's economy doesn't come only from friends of Lebanon in the Netherlands and France and elsewhere, but comes from the Lebanese. Now, the Lebanese diaspora has not played in the past a major political role in their host countries. Perhaps they are called to be more proactive politically wherever they are.
Thank you very much, Tarek. I would like to ask all speakers to come in, because I think that this has been a very interesting session. We have discussed many things, both issues, role of foreign powers, potential solutions. But we unfortunately are already running out of time. We're already a few minutes over time. But maybe because we have been looking to 2021, I can make a very quick round and ask you for some final words of optimism for Lebanon, and maybe something that you finally would like to share with the audience and all the people that are watching. Just in 1 or 2 sentences, may I ask to make a quick round. Paul, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think I expect in 2021, especially as when the pandemic begins to ebb, that there will be a massive resurgence of national protest. And I think part of that protest will be insisting on elections in the spring of 2022. And I hope that the momentum of national protest through the summer and fall leading to the winter and spring of 2022 will finally bring some political change in the elections of 2022. And I hope the international community can help Lebanon get there.
Thank you very much, Paul, for these hopeful words. Diasy, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I must say, from what I see today, it is very difficult to be, optimistic about 2021 in Lebanon. But what I do want to say is that the energy of people that are still here, the energy of people that are, deciding to stay and not to leave the country is very inspiring. And I think these are the people that are gonna have to make 2021 a better year here.
Thank you very much, Diasy, and also for transferring some of that energy to us in this session today. Basem, do you want to continue?
Yes, I am optimistic. It's Christmas time, and I have to be optimistic. The explosion that happened triggered something, and the effect we're not going to see except for a while. And people who say that, the protests didn't produce much, I think they're mistaken. I think there is an awakening, and I think political parties in Lebanon are taking notice, and many of them are taking civil society into consideration. And there's a lot of dialogue going on. And I am hopeful that this change that has happened will find its way into established political parties, and it will effect change.
Thank you very much, Basem, for these hopeful words, especially as you're saying in times of Christmas. Tarek, final word is to you. What hopeful words would you like to share with us?
We live in trying times, and there are times of uncertainty. And it's my hope, and many people's hope, that part of this uncertainty be dissipated and see more young people, whether in the streets or in their universities and elsewhere, reaffirm their belonging to Lebanon, not to their own respective communities only, but to Lebanon, and project themselves into the future, to have a sense that the future is possible. For the time being, every Lebanese you talk to does not see much more than a descent into further disintegration and chaos. And acts of generosity and solidarity that we see from various groups, non-governmental organizations and others, should be the ferment. Hope and pray, Christmas. Hope and pray that they will ferment a sense of faith in the future, in the ability to change and dissipate those clouds of uncertainty that are above our heads.
We hope will fade away. Thank you very much, Tarek, for these final words. Thanks a lot to all our guest speakers for sharing your views, sharing your perspectives, for answering the questions from the audience. You made this a very interesting and inspiring session. Thank you a lot. And of course, I would like to thank the audience as well, because many of you have participated in the session, have asked very good questions. So thanks a lot for that. Unfortunately, we are already over time, so we have to end this session. But on Friday, there will be the final session of this week. Again, from 4 to 5, there will be a session about US foreign policy, which is, of course, very interesting even until today. So hope to see you again on Friday. Enjoy the rest of your day.